Hi, welcome back. This is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. I wanted to pick up where I left off last week on what I consider part two, the modern era of the ketogenic diet. But before I do that, I wanted to go back, and this will be a video. I wanted to go back and just reflect over what I consider two important eras, coincidental eras, in which thinking came together and almost made a miraculous combination of, cross fertilization of different ideas almost happened but didn't. And also, I want to show how these same ideas that we've already talked about, the Banting diet of the 1860s in England, and how that became so popular, is really coming forward into the United States almost unchanged, with very little change. Okay, so what I consider these inflection points of history, one was a period of 1918 to 1922, and in the course of those 4 years, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Some you know and some you don't know, because I'm going to flesh it out later, and certainly in subsequent episodes. But in 1918, Otto Warburg, he's a doctor in Germany, and he is given the Nobel Prize for discovering that cancer grows in a low oxygen environment, and it also grows in an acidic, uh, an acid environment. Those two ideas have been, in essence, a little misrepresented in the subsequent 100 years. However, now, given a lot of current research that's happening in the last 15, 20 years, his ideas are becoming cutting edge. So he discovered that he was given the Nobel Prize for cancer grows in a low oxygen environment and it grows in an acidic environment. Okay? The second was 1921. We talked about this in the previous episode, that the ketogenic diet was coined and it was actually formulated, put together by Dr. Woodyot. And Dr. Woodyot was looking with Dr. Wilder, who's the one who's credited with coining the ketogenic diet, a diet that will generate ketone bodies when followed, that Dr. Woodyot was actually working with diabetics as well as epileptic children, pediatric epilepsy. So the diabetic aspect really is something you don't hear much about. So let me add a little bit to this and then move on. That his documentation of the diet for and with diabetics was so impressive, so well documented, so well carried out, that he did this in 1920, 21, 22, 23. This is in the pre-medication era. He showed that the effectiveness of the ketogenic diet in helping with these two disorders was so good that he was done so well that he received in 1948 the Banting Medal for Scientific Achievement. So that's the highest achievement, highest award for any research done in the field of diabetes. So notice that he did it in the 20s and it was given to him in 1948. Okay, so speaking of Banting? Well, in 1922, insulin was isolated by a team of people, but two doctors were given credit for it up at the University of Toronto in Canada. And one was Frederick Banting, and he had died within a decade in the early 1940s in a plane crash in Nova Scotia, and they then made this award for him. But he and his partner, who is credited with this, Dr. Frederick Banting and Charles Best, they went ahead and they got a patent on insulin. And guess what? They didn't charge anybody to use the patent. They didn't make a penny out of the patent. Can you imagine if they did patent it? They would have been untold bazillionaires. But in the era of the thinking just wasn't the thinking wasn't there to make money on people's health in that regard. It's just like the polio vaccine. Okay, I'm just floored with that. It floored in a good way with that way of thinking. Okay, so that was one inflection point. Three things happened. Second inflection point is in 1958 when two publications come out on the same time. One is in JAMA, which is an American publication, and the other came out. It was a booklet actually that was very popular in the UK. So In the U.S., it was weight loss. Dr. Pennington's weight loss formula is specifically he was showing this was about helping people lose weight, which is a big deal. And he said 48 patients succeeded in losing weight on a liberal caloric diet, high in protein and high in fat and low in carbs. And in the UK, there's the booklet entitled Eat Fat, Get Slim. And that pretty much said the same thing. It referred to it as a Stone Age diet of protein and fat with no restriction as to the amount eaten. The book was amazingly popular. It went on various newsreels, as I had mentioned before. It went through 6 editions. The interesting thing is that the foreword to this book was written by the wife of Hjalmar Stephenson, and he was the Arctic explorer that I spoke of last time. He was the Arctic explorer that lived with the Inuits. He was an anthropologist from Harvard, Canadian-born, Finnish origin, and he came back, among other things, and said, you don't need carbs to live. I've been living with the Inuits for years, and I never had any carbs. So, and to prove that, he allowed himself and one of his colleagues to be studied and documented 24/7 for a period of a year in terms of what they ate. So he went a year, and his colleague went a year without having any carbs for a year. So that, you might say, that was the first zero carb diet documented. Interesting. So his wife is the one that wrote the foreword to the booklet in 1958. Okay, let's move on to the modern era of the ketogenic diet. 2 competing views evolve on how to implement it. So when I say 2 competing views, it's not like they're controversially competing. The question comes down to, do we watch the carbs? How much protein do we have? And how much fat do we have? There's only 3 macronutrients. And so what is the way to look at this? So in 1970s is when the Atkins program came out. So that was Dr. Atkins, who read and was impressed by Dr. Pennington's work and that article on weight loss in JAMA. So he implemented that. And then he came out with his program, which is basically the same thing. And his focus was, his target audience, if you will, was anybody who wanted to lose weight, restore their metabolic efficiency. Notice the vocabulary is getting a little more sophisticated, but it was a shift from carbohydrate to fat burning. The objective was to stabilize insulin, reduce inflammation, as well as prevent and manage various cardiometabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes. So Dr. Atkins developed his diet, which was high in protein, high in fat, and nearly no carbs. The emphasis was on meats, cheese, eggs, discouraging carbs like bread, pasta, fruits, sugar. Weight loss was in a phase 1, phase 2 formulated program, but they're all pretty similar if you ask me, and you can certainly access this online. So the weight loss is kickstarted during the first phase, which requires the people to have 20 grams of carbs per day for at least 2 weeks. The focus should be on high fats, high proteins, but low carbs. Low carbs being veggies, leafy greens, peppers, cruciferous vegetables. Pretty straightforward, eh? So it's just on carbs, getting patients to have better quality carbs, but also, clients I should say, also to know how to count grams of their carbs per day. That was it. Okay, the Atkins program, now you know it. That gets modified in the future, and we're going to come up to that later. 1971, this was an attempt, this idea came up, and I'm going to tell you about in a second, came up as a modification of the classic ketogenic diet for pediatric epilepsy, because the classic ketogenic diet, as much as it is effective, and that story is told over and over and over again, though it lost popularity when the anti-seizure medications came on. This diet is called the MCT diet. So it's just like the classic ketogenic diet, but in that fat section, which children have a lot of fat, this person, he was a doctor at the University of Chicago, Dr. Huttenlocher, suggested, why don't we have MCTs, medium chain triglycerides? He chose medium MCTs, just like you've heard about MCT oils that you can get in grocery stores or health food stores and certainly online. So that very same MCT oil, he had the children take And that means they could take less fat. And therefore, they could have maybe more protein or more carbs and be a little bit more like their friends that they hung around with and not have to be so isolated in terms of their diet. So that's what this was about. So it was about liberalizing the ketogenic diet, and ends up that actually is a great idea, and that's one of the alternative ketogenic diets up to the present. So what the results were, basically, he was advocating for 70 to 75% fat in MCTs versus the classic ketogenic diet, which is 90% fat in terms of caloric intake. Along those lines of MCT, medium chain triglycerides, and in association with epilepsy, there's a study that came out in 2018, so I'm jumping ahead, just last week from the Lancet, that basically challenged the idea that it may not be the ketone bodies that are generated by the ketogenic diet or the MCT diet, but it may be something else. So it goes about it this way. It basically said the medium chain triglyceride ketogenic diet had been shown to directly inhibit specific receptors called glutamate receptors, which are excitatory receptors on neurons, and to change cell energies through mitochondrial biogenesis. What that means is simply turning on the rate of creating new mitochondria. It's a big deal. That's where all the energy is made. That's where your ketones come in. That's where your glucose comes in. So that's the powerhouse. But so they're saying, this oil, the MCT diet actually blocks the receptors. So they're advocating for a new idea, saying maybe it doesn't have anything to do with ketone bodies. Interesting thought. So it's the beginning of a new branch off the idea of the ketogenic diet being used for epilepsy. So keep that in the back of your mind. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to follow, and it should be pretty interesting. So in 1980s, Dr. Stephen Finney, he's an internist who studied and worked at a number of different places, but he was one of the first to start studying endurance athletes to see if their diet makes a difference to them. So in the context of athletes at that time, you heard the reference carbo loading or carb loading, and that simply meant that you trained, and then for the days or the weeks ahead when you're coming into your competition, is that you had a high carb diet. So he thought, well, what if you put endurance athletes, so this would be the opposite of sprinters and so on. So for endurance athletes, let's say we put them on a high-fat, low-carb diet and see what difference it makes. So he studied cyclists and found out it actually made a pretty significant difference. I'll leave that later because we're going to have sports and endurance athletes. We'll break down all the differences later, but know that this thinking had started in 1980. There was some positive documentation that this indeed is an advantage. Now I'm going to jump up to 2016, actually 2014. In 2014, there was, you probably know this person, there was one of the founders of the company called Trulia. As a real estate. It's like Zillow, and Trulia eventually was bought by Zillow. But he was a Finnish, I guess you have to call him a student. He was a Finnish student that wanted to come to Stanford to get his MBA. But it was so expensive to live in Palo Alto that he made a program to look for available places for him to rent, or for renters in general. So it was from this idea that Trulia got started, and I don't know if he's a billionaire, but he's a many millionaire over. So in 1914, where Dr. Stephen Finney gets involved, is that this person is called Sammy. His name is Sammy Inkinen. That he and his wife decide that they are going to row from Monterey, California to Hawaii, about 2,400 miles. It's been done before, and there's a competition for this. And so he's thinking that maybe he can modify his diet because he's heard about this the research, and now there's a significant amount of data on endurance athletes. So he gets Dr. Finney to formulate their diet so they can have, and the record to date, by the way, for a two-man or two-person boat, it's a special kind of rowboat, was 60 days. So they packed in 60 days of food. That would be a high-fat, low-carb diet, and off they went. So it ends up that they beat the existing record by 15 days. They made it there in 45 days. And not only that, when they were there, they weren't tired, they weren't exhausted, and they were actually stronger. So that was amazing. So it not only was the record broken by a lot, so that would have been broken by 25%, but they weren't exhausted. They weren't exhausted. That's usually what happens with endurance athletes, that they're total wrecks at the end of the race. They've worn themselves out. So there's a lot more coming on that. I thought that was fascinating. Because of that, Sammy has, now we're speaking up to current time as well, Sammy has invested a lot of his money, a lot of his funds, and involved Dr. Finney and Dr. Jeff Willick through Ohio State to form a company called Virta Health. And so Virta Health is exclusively focused on reducing the number of type 2 diabetics. And they're an institute that does a lot of research and a very evidence-based research. So we're going to be hearing more about that. And I think some of their first studies are going to be coming out available to the public in the next month or two. So that's very exciting. So that was Finney. That was Sammy. What an interesting story, huh? Okay, so in 1989, there's first formal comparative study of the classic ketogenic diet formulated in 1921 to the MCT, the medium chain triglyceride diet for epilepsy. And we find that they're both equally effective. That's pretty cool. That it's the same idea about high fat, slow carb, but now we're looking at the idea of maybe some fats are a little more efficient at creating ketone bodies, or efficient at keeping epileptic children from having seizures. Now we're looking at all that. 1990, Dr. Eric Westman, which in essence I don't know if he was the protege, but he had worked with Dr. Atkins. He now brings on the Atkins diet to formally establish what is now entitled obesity medicine. So now that's a specialty in medicine that one can go into that actually did not exist before. So he works out of Duke. He uses a variation of the Atkins diet, but still at 20 grams of protein per day is the limitation. So things haven't changed that much. They're a little more aware of the amount of protein. We'll get into that later, but still high fat. Okay, now another little inflection point. If there was another inflection point, this would be it. In 1993, there was a 3-year-old child that was severely epileptic. And I'm sure there was lots of children that were severely epileptic. This one is going to be a little bit different. His name is Charlie, and he is the son of a Hollywood producer and director. And he has epilepsy that is so severe that no medication can touch it. He lives basically a drugged, lifeless existence. And he even had certain surgeries to help with his epilepsy, and nothing has helped. And his father would describe his son's existence as he lived life in slivers, the momentary conscious moments between his medications. His father, by luck primarily, learned about the classic ketogenic diet. And he found out that it actually is still being practiced at Johns Hopkins. So they all packed up and went over to Johns Hopkins Institute, the East Coast, Baltimore, and started the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is interesting in the sense that we've talked about fasting before and how that was the way of treating epilepsy prior to the 20s. That they have 2 days of fasting and then they start the classic ketogenic diet by 1/3 and 2/3 and full on. He had immediate results. They were so pleased, and there began. He was so pleased and actually so angry. He was angry at why he didn't know about this. Why he was led down the road of drugs and surgery before hearing about diet. There's that. But at the same time, he was so inspired to help get the word out. So he got the word out that he then in 1994 had NBC Dateline, which was a really popular show at the time with Ted Koppel, Dateline do a report on his son, Charlie Abrams, and how the ketogenic diet helped him at Johns Hopkins, etc., and the whole story. Later that year, he started the foundation called the Charlie Foundation for Pediatric Epilepsy, and based on the story of Charlie. But it goes on and on and on. He is in the background now realizing that by the media, by his use of the media, his understanding of the media, his savvy ability, and his contacts and everything, he can get the word out. But he's now going to have to educate the medical population, the hospitals, and so on, that treat epilepsy in terms of the ketogenic diet. So they make videotapes and send them all out, and he prepares. He has a lot. He brings the quality of care up in terms of them, the departments for that treats pediatric epilepsy, in knowing how to use and implement the ketogenic diet for children. So then, in 1997, he comes out with a TV movie called First Do No Harm, which is a kind of representation of the experience that they had with their son, starring Meryl Streep, and now they got a ton of attention, and calls started pouring into Johns Hopkins, and so from there, they obviously were referred out to all the other various hospitals, and away it goes. The ketogenic diet has found a new life, and certainly the Johns Hopkins Center for Epilepsy has found a new life as well. So they started the foundation, the Charlie Foundation. They now have a number of hospitals that are treating children for the classic ketogenic diet. Very impressive. Wanted to go back just a little bit because in 1995, it's hard to follow the chronology so specifically, so we're jumping back and forth now, but you're getting the sense that the intensity of interest in the ketogenic diet is getting deeper and deeper. I mean, each year things happened, whereas before it was decades would go by or half a century would go by. Well, that's not the case. It's almost down to minutes now. So in 1995, there were two different applications of the ketogenic diet with pediatric epilepsy, but kids that also had cancer. So this was used as an adjunctive treatment for cancer, and both are positive results. One was just a study of following out of Warburg's idea that if we could replace, remember that the cancer that he discovered, cancer was low oxygen and was primarily in an acidic environment and it depended on glucose. So the idea came, consequently, not he had this idea but never got implemented. Can they replace that fuel, glucose, with ketones? So ketone was the viable alternative fuel source for a lot of things. Now we know that, but we didn't know that then. So this was a bold step forward. If we can have these cancer patients that are children, be on a ketogenic diet, which they probably were anyway if they were being treated, that maybe that would be a difference in their cancer outcome. Sure enough, for various outcomes, as a general research project, that was very successful in one group, and that was done at the Ohio Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Ohio. And then another was more specific. It was the use of the ketogenic diet with specifically SSI Tomos, which are brain tumors, to women, pediatric patients. So that was successful. So without getting into all the details, we'll go into cancer as a whole separate topic, but that also was done at Case Western Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. So the reason I reference that, and I want to make it pretty obvious that this isn't an anecdotal story that somebody said, oh, by the way, try this. This was done, it was studied, they had documented evidence that it was helpful. It wasn't the sole treatment being offered to these kids. And the second one wasn't kids. It was adjunctive. So it's brewing back there. Ketogenic diet for cancer. We'll get into that in a little bit. Okay. In 1998, we have the first multicenter study for the efficacy of ketogenic diet for pediatric epilepsy. It was funded by the Charlie Foundation and Johns Hopkins. So you go, well, wait a minute, I thought we've been all over this. We've been doing the the world been doing a ketogenic diet for epilepsy since the 20s? True, but there actually hasn't been a formal multi-centered, meaning different people are following the same formula, if you will, the same way to implement the ketogenic diet, and will they get similar results? It's the first time that's ever been done. So this was done, and to answer that, yes, they had similar outcomes, and now it's been confirmed. So from this sort of blanket approach and such a broad application, geographically broad, and used for epilepsy, the question is starting to brew up. We have a little cancer experience as adjunctive treatments. What else can ketone bodies be used for? What about the ketogenic diet? What can that be used for generally? Is it something that people should do or not do? Is this esoteric or is it not esoteric? Okay, so what other potential uses of BHB, beta hydroxybutyrate? It's one of the ketone bodies, pretty much the ketone body that everybody measures in these particular situations. This is now the cover is coming off the idea of the ketogenic diet, ketones, ketone bodies. Where else can we do? We now have a little bit of endurance athletes, a little bit of cancer, certainly epilepsy. What else is out there? Okay, so the answer to what else can it be applied to, the answer is this. It really can be applied to any condition where the oxygen supply to cells has become limited. Remember, think about cancer. Remember what Otto Warburg had said. It has become limited. Therefore, nearly any disease state, some of you probably saying, well, that's probably not very helpful. Any disease state really doesn't tell me. Well, go back to Warburg a little bit. When he was asked what did he think the cause of cancer was, he thought the cause of cancer was pollution. That is, being exposed to toxic environmental exposures or having environmental exposures that were toxic. And there's a variety of those. But that in combination with being undernourished. So this idea of low oxygen has to do with being undernourished or malnourished, if you will. And so various ways. So those are the things that he thought predisposed the growth of cancer. And then he studied on the growth of cancers. So since 2000, this is very remarkable. So if one was to add up all the studies, all the formal studies of all the medical, at the universities and medical journals around the world, 2000, back as far as you could go, there's only 225 studies on the ketogenic diet. From 2000 to 2015, there's 1,400 studies done on the application of the ketogenic diet. Since then, from 2000 to 2018, which is now, there's been nearly 2,000 studies. So you can see the intensity of looking into the ketogenic diet, its various aspects, the ketones, the ketone bodies, is phenomenal. Weight loss, So let me just ring off some of these things as they started to pop out of the research. 2004, formal studies on physical performance, Alzheimer's, depression. 2005, Parkinson's, TBI, traumatic brain injury. Think of football players, that's been in the news a lot, car accidents, so on and so forth. Type 2 diabetes, Lafforia body disease, which is a genetic form of progressive epilepsy. PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. That's a fascinating situation. It's always been associated with high blood sugar levels or dysglycemia and metabolic syndrome. You can say, well, those things make sense. 2006, ALS, neurological illness. 2007, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Amazing. And migraines. So the shift to the keto metabolism goes far beyond the swapping of one fuel for another. Now it's out there. There's a lot of other applications we're finding are appropriate for this. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, which is really considered type 3 diabetes. 2010, Jeff Willick, who I've mentioned a few times, he's now at Ohio State in Columbus. He was at UConn. And why I mentioned that because I had practiced in Southern Connecticut in Old Lyme and at Mystic, and I was surprised when I first learned of Jeff Willick that he was at UConn at the time. I thought, wow, that's amazing. So he came out with a book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, co-authored with Dr. Finney that I told you about, and then also The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. Then after that, the New Atkins Diet, co-authored with Dr. Westman. So you can see how all these fronts are really being documented and being expanded. So now you and I can read this and do this on our own. It's no longer a esoteric medical treatment that you need to go in and spend weeks working with your doctor or even admitted to a hospital to have this to have you trained to do this. No, you could read about this, and you should read about this, and it will change your health. I have no doubt. So another issue that it starts to rise up now. I gave you at the end of the last episode. I told you about how the dominant thinking was that high cholesterol was bad, saturated fats were bad, they were basically a sort of heart disease and so on. Well, that was because of Ansel Keys. He was the man of the year in 1961, Time magazine, because of his bogus study of, diet in various countries and their correlations with saturated fats. So this is being challenged. The idea of saturated fats as not being bad, perhaps even being good, is being expressed in a number of places. 2004, Dr. Thomas Seyfried, which is Boston College, comes out with a huge book, and it's worth reading every page, called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. And so his whole approach is, as I've mentioned before, based on Otto Warburg's. It's like, well, if we can switch over the fuel, the energy source for our whole body to ketones, primarily, that maybe that will stop various cancers. And he's finding that to be true. And the stories that he illustrates, absolutely worth buying your book, that book. If this book is too big for you, too heavy for you, there's another book called Tripping Over the Truth, which is about a third the size. It pretty much offers the same summary, but I would say get both. It's a fascinating topic, and it's worth going deep on because you may be applying it for yourself or somebody near you. 2006, I mentioned this book before. Stephen Finney comes out with, he's a brain specialist in terms of fatty acid metabolism and the neurology of the brain up at Sherbrooke University in Quebec. His book is called Survival of the Fattest, The Key to Human Brain Evolution. And I won't go into this, I went into it before, but say his assumptions were that shellfish, fish, and shore-based animals and plants are the richest and dietary sources of key nutrients needed by the brain. So we now live on Cape Cod, and so we've had probably more shellfish than I've had my whole lifetime, and gone out clamming and so on and so forth. And we've learned a lot about shellfish that I didn't know that much of. They're also the highest source of B12 of anything you can eat, higher than meats and higher than other fish. And fish in general and all seafood in general are a really good source of omega-3s. That's EPA and DHA. DHA is a fat, which is a kind of an omega-3. That one kind of fat represents 20% of your brain. I mean, the fat that is in your brain. So the fathead he talks about is 20% DHA. So that's a big deal. And they find these particular omega-3 fat deficiencies also correlate with dementia and Alzheimer's to an extent. His points in his book were evolution in general depends on a special combination of circumstances. And you can say, well, yeah, that's true. One is part genetics, of course, part time for things to evolve, and part environment. So that's the basis. It's a fascinating read. I put more information down here you can look at. You can certainly, I hope you get the book. Really interesting. I've heard him speak a number of times. We've communicated. I really appreciate his work a lot. He also has studied the effectiveness of C10 and C8. So that's part of the MCT oil, okay? And he found that C8 is far more effective at creating ketones via the liver than C10. In 2008, first randomized controlled trial proving the efficacy of the classic ketogenic diet for the management of epilepsy. And so, wait a minute, this really goes back to, isn't this the same old all over again? No, this is randomized. In other words, instead of having this big plan and all these centers doing it at the same time, they're saying, can this be reproducible in different places? And they find it is randomized. Also means that they have some people are on it and some people aren't, and they find out that it's actually very effective. You can look that up as well for all the details. But so it's getting more and more confirmed. What we knew before is now being pulled into the modern world of being documented as it should be, as a medical research experiment. 2014, ketogenic diet and calorie restriction show promise in improving cancer outcomes. So part of Thomas Siegfried at Boston College and his book and the research he's involved with is not only about the ketogenic diet, but it's also about calorie restriction. Let's think back about fasting. Fasting clearly is all about calorie restriction. It's no calories, and that puts you into a ketogenic diet. He's pulling in a little of both. And you could say, well, when you think about how pediatric children started their the classic ketogenic diet, they had to fast, they had to restrict their calories, and then they embarked on the ketogenic diet. So these variables are already out there. 2014, ketones used as a therapy for Alzheimer's. Dr. Mary Newport, I've heard her speak. Her husband did have Alzheimer's, did eventually die, but she was just sort of groping for ideas, and she remembered MCTs being used, and so she got some MCT oil for her husband. Things improved. Then exogenous ketones were just in the research stage. She did have access to some of that. That also improved. So she showed by changing the fats in the ketogenic diet, inducing a ketogenic diet with her husband, he improved. He couldn't pull back completely. He couldn't be completely recovered, but it's an amazing story. She has it well documented. Subsequent to that was use of MCT oils for Parkinson's and improvement there. Also for multiple sclerosis, MS. Dr. Terry Walls at the Cleveland Clinic is an amazing story. She has a whole protocol, not exclusively based on the ketogenic diet, but is one of the tenets in the diet. You may want to read on that. I'm just giving you the applications here. In 2014, a doctor in South Africa, Dr. Tim Noakes, and he was a famous kind of doctor of the athletes as well as an athlete himself, from many marathons and such. And he was a big carb loader. He wrote books on it. Carb loading, yep, it was absolutely necessary. So when he became converted, so to say, into the ketogenic diet, and he realized he had made a big mistake, he took a 180-degree turn and said, nope, carbs are out. He's big into not only working with athletes, he has a whole foundation, and also preventing type 2 diabetes and helping to treat type 1 as well. So the issue in 2014 with him specifically is that, in my words, he was baited into tweeting something that could be misconstrued, and because of this one tweet to someone's question on his advice for the ketogenic diet for pregnant women, that he was brought to court. So for 2.5 years, the medical establishment in South Africa had brought him to court to strip away his license. And yet he was a famous author and researcher of the diets, et cetera, and this is what was happening. I'm sure this can be made into a movie, but what is interesting is doctors from around the world came to testify in his behalf. And just within the last 2 months, he was acquitted. And to hear his stories, how some of the prosecuting attorneys would come over to ask for him to sign his book for them. Anyway, so Dr. Noakes' diet consists of 5 to 10% carbohydrates, 60% fat, 30% protein. And I know you've heard that before, from Banting to the classic ketogenic diet to Atkins, and they are all just slivers apart. 2014, Dr. Kune made presentations about the CA triglycerides being the most effective ketogenic fat of the MCT oil. 2014 was also the year that the first exogenous ketone was created. That was pretty much a collaboration with D'Agostino from the University of South Florida with Patrick Arnold at Keto Sports. And that was a BHB, beta-hydroxybutyrate salt. We're going to talk more about this in the next episode of exogenous ketones, so I'm just skipping over the chronology here. But the interesting thing is how Dom got into this was through a grant of the Department of Defense to help divers, SEAL divers, that would dive these rebreathers called MICs that wouldn't have any bubbles, so they could have this breathe on, in essence, high oxygen in a special mix, that they could go distances at 50 feet or under without any bubbles and therefore go undetected. Well, they would also get epileptic seizures, in essence, epileptic seizures on the oxygen due to the oxygen toxicity. So he thought, well, what about the ketogenic diet relative to this? Maybe there's something they could do. So he worked and is still working on various forms of BHB, beta hydroxybutyrate, and exogenous ketone. But not only did he solve that, yes, that they found that they took that, they didn't have the toxicity. They also found out if you were on a ketogenic diet that you could hold your breath longer underwater. That's interesting. More on that to come. 2016, August 6th. So I told you before, 2014, August 6th, I told you about how Sami and his wife went to Monterey in Hawaii at 2,400 miles, and they made it in 45 days instead of 60 days, 15 days off the record. Their boat was called Fat Chance. Pretty good play on words, huh? And they were all about no sugar, a sugarless, high-fat, low-carb diet. Well, in 20, I'm going to have to jump to the present, because just last week there was a crew of 4 men that also rowed a whole different race from the Canary Islands down to Antigua. So that was 3,000 miles. It was a longer race, and they broke the record by 5 days. Amazing. So they also were on a ketogenic diet, and they said it was primarily an MCT ketogenic diet. How's that? Wrapping up here, in 2016, first international conference, Ketogenic Diet, held at the University of South Florida. Also that year, first low-carb conference in the U.S. 2017, as I mentioned before, Tim Noakes, MD, is exonerated by the South African court. And also in 2017, the first publicly available exogenous ketone ester, not a ketone salt, was made available. All that to be discovered, all that to be detailed later. That will be the end of today. I appreciate your time.